Welcome back, scholars. Today I want to talk a little bit about Chapter 10 in our textbook, which deals with racial and ethnic inequality. And so we're going to talk about the difference between an individual's race and ethnicity. We'll talk about what it means to be a member of a minority group. We'll talk about prejudice and discrimination and the similarities between those and the differences between those. We'll look at how the sociological perspectives look at race and ethnic inequality, racial and ethnic inequality, and how they view race, the concept of race. We're going to look at how dominant groups can interact with minority groups and vice versa. We'll talk about race and ethnicity here in the United States. We'll talk about immigration and the diversity that we have in our country. And, I personally see that as a strength of this country, but some people see it as a weakness or as a problem in our country. I think it's a action-packed, full chapter. And so let's jump right in and talk a little bit about this. When we talk about race, we're talking about a group of people who are set apart because of physical differences. Okay, so a racial group is a group that is set apart from others because of physical differences that have taken on social significance. Now, in the grand scheme of things, sociologists tend to take the position that race is really a meaningless category for the most part, because people are pretty much the same regardless of their racial heritage. There has been a tremendous amount of marriages and relationships between different racial groups throughout the history of humankind. And therefore, while someone might see me as a white person, the reality is that I have a whole plethora of racial contributions from different racial and ethnic groups. So this idea of a pure race, whether we're talking about Africans, people of African descent, people of Asian descent, or whites, really there is no such thing as a pure race. The differences, the genetic differences between people of different racial categories are so minute. There's something that we examine called analysis of variance. And analysis of variance is a statistical procedure that we can run on different data sets that tell us it analyzes whether the differences within a group are greater than or lesser than the differences between groups. And if you do an analysis of variance on things like intelligence and various skills and attributes on the basis of race, typically that analysis of variance will show us that there are greater differences within groups than there are between groups. And so therefore race as a concept is really not that meaningful, except for the fact that we as human beings have decided that certain physical characteristics, skin color, hair texture, shape of nose, and other physical attributes, we have decided that those are meaningful. Surprisingly, eye color, which is another human variation, is not considered part of a racial category. So we don't put people in a racial category on the basis of eye color, but we do on skin color and some other variables that really don't have a lot of significance beyond the significance that we as human populations have put on those concepts. And so we'll talk about that more as we get into the chapter. It is the culture of a particular society that constructs and attaches social significance to those physical differences. So here in the United States, if someone is African American, then there are certain stereotypes that we apply to those individuals, and we have decided what physical differences constitute someone being of a different racial category from our own. Okay, ethnic groups are somewhat similar, except that here the differences in the groups are not based on physical differences, but on cultural differences. Okay, so an ethnic group is a group that's set apart from others primarily because of its national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. So if we think about a category that sometimes people think of as a racial category. If we think of like Hispanic Americans are actually not a racial group, they're an ethnic group because they may come from different countries. And what unites them as Hispanic people is that they have a Spanish language in their culture. And so they are set apart from others because of their national origin and because of their culture, not because of the physical differences. Okay, a Hispanic person can be white or they can be black. There are black Hispanics and white Hispanics. And so it's not a racial category, it is actually an ethnic category. So if we think about the racial composition of our country, you've got a chart in your, or actually a table in your book, table 10-1A, that shows racial groups in the United States as of 2016. And so we see that white non-Hispanics make up about 60.5% of the overall population of the United States. African Americans make up about 12.7%. That hasn't changed a whole lot in the 30 years that I've been teaching this class. It's been around 12-13%. We see that Native Americans and Alaskan Natives are almost 1%. The other groups that are significant, we see Chinese. If you look at Asians, that's about 6.6% of the American population, Asian and Pacific Islanders. And then everybody else is kind of broken into smaller groups out of that. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of the racial composition of the United States. Now, we said that there's a difference in race and ethnicity. If we think about the ethnic composition in the United States, we see that the largest group is German Americans at 13.9%. So whites are broken down into different countries of origin and cultures. So German Americans, 13.9%, Irish Americans, 10%, English Americans, 7.4%, Italian Americans, 5.2%, Polish Americans, 2.9%, and so on and so forth. And then for Hispanic Americans, we see that they are 17.8%. And then they're broken down into Mexican Americans, Salvadorans, and Colombians, and so on and so forth. So that kind of gives us an idea of the diversity that exists in this country. And like I said in earlier videos and earlier in this video, I think the real strength of the United States has been for a long time that this is a country that people come to from all over the world, and they have to assimilate to the dominant culture, but they also bring with them a number of cultural components that really enrich our lives. A lot of the things that we enjoy have been influenced by other countries and by the people who came here from other countries. The music that we listen to, the food that we eat, the beliefs and practices that we have been influenced by all the people who have come here from other cultures. And ultimately, we are all immigrants. Some of us got here earlier than others, but unless you're full-blood Native American, you are an immigrant to this country at some point in your history, in your family's history. It may be your great-great-great-grandfather who immigrated to this country back in the 1600s, but we are all descended from immigrants unless we are Native American, and at some point they came, across the land bridge from Asia. So I think it's interesting if we think of things in that way. I think it tends to make it easier to understand the plight of people who are recent arrivals in this country and are trying to assimilate and improve their lives of themselves and their families. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to be a minority group. Your textbook defines a minority group as a subordinate group whose members have significantly less control or power over their own lives than the members of a dominant or majority group have over theirs. Okay, so when we're talking about minority group, there's nothing in there that talks about power, about numbers, right? It's all about power. Okay, so women, even though they make up 51% of the population, are viewed by sociologists as a minority group because up until fairly recently, women have had relatively little power compared to men. Now, I think you can make the point that in the last couple of decades, that there's been a real change in the amount of power that women have. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. We have not had a female president yet, but we are having increasing numbers of women and women of color who are running for the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they're having some success. And so I think, but if we look at things like, well, how many female CEOs are there? The last time I checked, if you look at Fortune 500 companies, so that's the top 500 companies in the U.S., about 20, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, 22 of them had female CEOs. Okay, so even though women have increased their political and economic power pretty significantly over the last few decades, they still lag far behind men in terms of economic and political power. Okay, so women would be considered a minority group by sociologists, not because of their numbers, but because of their relative lack of power compared to males. So when we think about the properties of a minority group, in order for somebody to say that I belong to a minority group, they need to have experienced some unequal treatment compared to the dominant group. Certainly women, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans can all say and point to instances in not only in their lives, but in their history, in the history of those groups where people have been disadvantaged, have been treated unequally on the basis of their membership to those groups. Physical or cultural traits that can be identified. So there has to be something that identifies them as being different, whether it's their culture, their national origin, or their physical traits. There has to be something that we can say, hey, that person is different from the dominant group, and therefore they are singled out for unequal treatment. And generally, it is an ascribed status. And we talked about ascribed and achieved statuses earlier in the semester, I believe. And an achieved status is something that you earn or that you come to through your own efforts. An ascribed status is something that you're born into. And so, generally speaking, people are born into a minority group or the dominant group, and you don't really get to choose that. That's not something that you can achieve or that you can choose. There's a feeling of solidarity within the group. So, the women's movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, organizations like LULAC that try to advocate for better treatment of Hispanics who are working in the farm industry, Latinos. Those are groups that are showing some solidarity in pushing for the rights of the group that's been treated unequally. Okay, and then there tends to be in-group marriage. Now, in the case of females, obviously that's not the case. There we're talking about a group that is a minority group on the basis of their gender, and so therefore you don't have in-group marriage. But within most other minority groups, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and so on and so forth, there is a tendency to marry within the group. Jewish people, there is a tendency to marry within the group, and that is significant. Okay, so as I said, research shows that race is not really a meaningful way of differentiating people. There's no systematic genetic differences between racial groups that affect social behavior and abilities. And so race is not something that really has a significant impact on us, except for the fact that it may make us the member of either the dominant group or a minority group, and that can lead to either privilege or disadvantage. Okay. Sociologists use the term racial group to refer to those folks who are set apart from others by obvious physical differences. And so we're talking primarily about the dominant group, whites, and minority groups. And so when we use the term racial group, we're talking about groups that are set apart because of physical differences for different types of life chances and experiences. Okay. So what constitutes an obvious physical difference? Well, that's up to cultural interpretation, correct? Absolutely. So your text talks about this concept of the social construction of race. And as I said earlier, because cultures determine what constitutes a significant physical difference, That's what we mean by the social construction of race. The process of defining race benefits those who have more power and privilege. In the United States, we see differences in skin color and hair color. Differences in skin color have dramatic social and political meaning. Differences in hair color doesn't really have social or political meaning, just as eye color doesn't really have impact in that way. Subtle differences in skin color often go unnoticed, but people tend to lump others together in categories of black, white, and Asian. Okay. So figure 10-1 just gives you an idea of how the racial composition of this country has changed from when Columbus sailed here and discovered the native peoples that were already residing here, and how the influxes from different parts of the world through immigration have changed the composition of the country. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but I would encourage you to look at that figure and look at how the composition of our population has changed over the centuries. Okay. Now, this concept of racial formation is what sociologists call a socio-historical process in which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and then discarded, destroyed, and we move on to other categories. For example, we used to talk about Caucasians and Mongoloids, not Mongoloids in terms of people with, birth defects or anything like that, but people who were from the Mongolian region versus the Caucasus region of the world were labeled differently on the basis of those racial categories. Today we have new racial categories that are probably equally as meaningless as those other earlier definitions. But anyway, those who have power define the groups of people according to a racist social structure, according to the social constructionist view of race. Okay. If we think about reservation systems and how people get assigned to different Native American reservations, and we think about the one drop rule, the idea is that if you have one drop of African heritage in your background, then you're considered to be black. If we think about Tiger Woods and the fact that he has Asian heritage, but he also has some African American heritage and some white heritage, and yet he is looked at as the most successful black golfer in the history of the PGA. So I think we can see then how fluid racial definitions can be. And I remember reading about a sociologist who had married and had children, and his wife passed away suddenly, and he had to move back close to his family. Well, his children had grown up thinking that their family was white, and when he lost his wife and he moved back closer to his family, they discovered that their grandparents were at least one set of grandparents were African American, and so now they were totally just by moving closer to their grandparents, they were defined as an African American family, and you can imagine how much of an adjustment that probably took in terms of dealing with a new racial identity. Okay, in 1900, W.E.B. Du Bois predicted that the color line was the foremost problem facing this country in the 20th century, and I think recent events with the Black Lives Matter protests and the government efforts to crush those protests indicates that it's probably going to continue to be the foremost one of the foremost problems that face this country going forward. So unfortunately, even though things have changed significantly, I think Martin Luther King and Malcolm X would say that yes, there have been some pretty significant changes in our society. There's still a tremendous amount of racism and discrimination, and unfortunately, the lives of black families have improved, but not nearly enough. They have not improved as much as the lives of other groups have improved over the last 40, 50 years. Okay. Immigration from Latin America in the late 1900s showed the fluid nature of race formation, And in the 2010 census, over 9 million people in the United States were identified as biracial or multiracial. So that's really that's a new category on the census that allows us to select multiracial or biracial categories that weren't available before. And we see that half of the people who classified as multiracial were under the age of 18. So that would indicate to us a couple of things, I think. One, it would indicate that interracial marriages and relationships are on the rise. It would probably also indicate that people have often had to choose a category and answer one or the other. Now with the new categories, people are able to select, and there's probably less stigma associated with selecting multiple categories. There was a time when being biracial was seen as a stigmatizing characteristic in this country, and it may still be to some extent, but I hope that that is declining as we see more people identifying as biracial. Okay. And so in terms of ethnicity, as I said, we're talking about groups that are set apart not because of physical differences, but because of cultural differences or because of national origin. So let's talk a little bit more about ethnic groups. Ethnic groups are set apart because of those cultural or national origin differences. In the United States, people with a Spanish-speaking background are collectively referred to as Latinos, Latinas, or Hispanics. Also, we're seeing the use of the term Latinx to refer to people who are Latin, but we're not necessarily distinguishing between males and females there. And while these groupings can be convenient in terms of trying to figure out how different groups are doing compared to each other, aside from that, they really are not particularly useful, and they can obscure differences within the categories. So, for example, if we say Hispanic Americans, well, the experiences of Mexican Americans have been somewhat different from, for example, the differences, the experiences of Salvadoran Americans or Cuban Americans, and so I think it's important. And when we think about Asian Americans, well, if you're Asian American, you could come from a Pacific island, or you could come from Japan, or you could come from Vietnam or Korea or China. There's a lot of territory covered in that category of Asian. And if we assume that all Asians are like each other, I mean, think about it. India is considered to be a part of the Asian continent, so someone from India is Asian. Their life experiences are probably somewhat different from someone who grew up in Samoa, for example. And so, yes, these groupings and these identifications can be useful if we're trying to make some generalizations about folks, but it can obscure differences between people who may share some heritage or some physical characteristics in common, but come from radically different cultures and have had radically different experiences as American citizens. So the distinction between what constitutes a racial category and ethnic category are not always real clear, but it can be socially significant, as we've talked about. Now let's talk about why this matters, and I think it matters because of the tendency of people to experience prejudice and discrimination on the basis of their membership in a minority group. So when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about an attitude. So if you believe that those people are less intelligent, or those people are more athletic, or those people like this, or those people like that, if you make those assumptions, that's what we mean by prejudice, because you are prejudging someone on the basis of a stereotype that exists in our society. So I remember some examples of prejudice that I've seen in my lifetime. For example, the Dallas Cowboys. I'm a big Cowboys fan, and the Dallas Cowboys drafted Tony Dorsett from Pitt University back when Tom Landry was still the coach. And when Tom Landry coached the team, if you were a rookie, you didn't get to play on the first game of the season. Usually, he would work you in slowly and see if you earned the right to get on the field. So it was probably 3 or 4 or 5 games into the season, and Tony Dorsett finally got to go out and run the ball, and at some point he scored a touchdown. And when he ran into the end zone, some people unfurled this banner showing a picture of a watermelon. And the prejudice there is the stereotyping that all African Americans like watermelon. Okay. Well, first of all, we know that not all African Americans like watermelon. And two, there are a lot of people who like watermelon who are not African American. I happen to like watermelon, but I'm not African American. And so to stereotype people in that way is to judge them all on the basis of a representation or our views of a representation of a category of people. So that's certainly, prejudice is certainly an issue, but when it becomes a real issue is when that prejudice is manifested in discrimination. Okay, and so discrimination is actual behaviors, denying opportunities to someone on the basis of their membership as a female or African American or whatever we're discriminating against. And so discrimination is a more serious concern. But it obviously has its roots in prejudice. People typically are not going to discriminate against someone that they or society doesn't have prejudices against. Okay. And we've made a lot of progress in terms of trying to address prejudice and discrimination in this country, at least legally. But I would say to you that there are tons of examples of minority groups still receiving unequal treatment, even though it's not legal anymore. In housing practices and lending practices by banks and things of that nature, there is not a level playing field. And no matter how much somebody shouts that there is a level playing field, it doesn't change the fact that the lives of whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians are different partially on the basis of the way people respond to those different categories. That's just a fact. Okay. Now, how do we address that, and what do we do? That's when we get into theory. But the facts are that not everyone has equal access to the scarce resources in society, and some of that access is limited on the basis of our membership to various groups, and those might be minority groups or the dominant group. Okay. And recently we've seen a number of incidents on college campuses that give us reason to be concerned. For example, we've seen student-run newspapers and radio stations airing stories that either perpetuate stereotypes or use inflammatory language in regards to minority groups and things of that nature. We've also seen white supremacist organizations going to college campuses and recruiting on those campuses and using social media in order to try to encourage students to join their extremist groups. That certainly is a concern. And unfortunately, in some cases, there have actually been violent clashes between black and white students. And so I think we've got a long ways to go in order to achieve racial equality, racial and ethnic equality in this country. And of course, as I said, with recent reactions and rhetoric from the government concerning, stereotypes about different minority groups, I think it's very, very clear that we've got a long ways to go. And, even when we talk about the way police officers use their judgment in terms of choosing to use a taser on someone, to use lethal force by pulling their weapon, those decisions are influenced by the race of the person who the police are interacting with. And until that changes, I think we're going to continue to see, groups like Black Lives Matter out there trying to get the attention of the American population and bring about change. Okay. So as I said, prejudice is simply a negative attitude about an entire group of people. Ethnocentrism, we've talked about that. That's the tendency to assume that one's own culture and way of life are superior to others, and it's real easy to go from saying that my culture is superior to looking at other people as less than and discriminating against them. And of course, racism is defined as the belief that one race is supreme and others are innately inferior. I would say that different racial categories have had different opportunities, and that leads to the differences in outcomes. And so, if we can eliminate those differences on the basis of the social construction of race and ethnicity, then I think you'll see more advancement for groups that have historically been discriminated against and denied opportunities. Okay. So stereotypes are defined as unreliable generalizations about all members of a group that do not recognize individual differences within the group. People tend to respond to the objective features of a situation or a person and the social meaning that that carries connected to that person. And eventually, false stereotypes can become real in their consequences. And let me give you an example of this. So if let's say that I'm a police officer, and in my heart of hearts, I just know that blue-eyed people are more criminal than brown-eyed people. It starts out as just a thought, just a feeling, just an impulse, pardon me. But over time, I start to scrutinize the behavior of blue-eyed people more than brown-eyed people. If I encounter a blue-eyed person on the street, I may stop them and frisk them. And, when I frisk them, I may occasionally come across contraband, weapons, or drugs and things of that nature. And so over a period of time, because I'm suspicious of blue-eyed people and the other officers around me are suspicious of blue-eyed people, and we tend to focus our attention on blue-eyed people, eventually we're going to find some blue-eyed people who are breaking the law, and eventually the crime statistics will start to show that blue-eyed people are indeed being arrested and convicted more frequently than brown-eyed people. And so now it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was looking at them and focusing on them, therefore I was more likely to catch them doing things wrong. Now, do we really believe that the eye color has any impact on whether somebody's criminal or not? I don't really believe that, just as I don't really believe that race has an impact on whether somebody's criminal or not until you spend a few hundred years discriminating against various groups, and at some point you do create a self-fulfilling prophecy where there are more African Americans and Hispanic Americans in prison, disproportionately more than there are the dominant group. So if we started with a level playing field, I think things would be quite a bit different. But we're not starting with a level playing field, and that's what sociologists are trying to get people to think about and to explore this idea that unequal treatment can lead to frustration and aggression and violence from people who have been treated unfairly and unequally for a long period of time. And I don't think anybody would argue that African Americans in our history as a country, that African Americans have not been treated unfairly or differently. Certainly, the same can be said of Native Americans. Genocide, an attempt to wipe them off of the face of the planet, put on reservations, their children taken away from them and educated in white schools. Those are all just examples of situations where Native Americans have been treated very, very harshly by the dominant group. And in this case, military might allowed the dominant white group to seize control and power. And, you might have heard recently that almost half of Oklahoma has been given back to Native peoples because they were granted that in treaties. I suspect that there are some very nervous people right now who realize that they're living on land that was at one point part of a treaty between the United States government and Native populations, and they're fearful that they may lose access to some of that property. So, it might be interesting to see what happens if we actually start living up to some of the treaties that we signed with Native peoples. Okay. So, let's talk about what is called colorblind racism. Okay, so we've all heard people say, well, I don't judge people by the color of their skin. I judge them by their character and by their behaviors. Okay, and that sounds really great. And I applaud those people for making an effort to be fair. But what can happen then is that when you look at the fact that African Americans are disproportionately in prison, they make up about 13% of the population, but they make up a significantly larger percentage of the prison population. You can say, well, gosh, see, I'm not judging them by their skin color, but they're clearly more criminal than other groups. And the reality is that is just not true. When I was at LSU working on my PhD, we were asked to do some research on the so-called relationship between race and crime. And what we found, what the graduate students that I was working with found, was that when you control for socioeconomic status, in other words, you compare the crime rates of lower class African Americans to the crime rates of lower class white Americans to crime rates of lower class Hispanic Americans to lower class Asian Americans, guess what? The relationship between race and crime totally disappears. So the important variable there is not the race of the person, it's the socioeconomic status of the person. Poverty is one of the major things that causes crime. And when you've got a group that is disproportionately poor compared to the dominant group, you're going to have higher crime rates among that group. So what looks like a relationship between race and crime is in fact not at all a relationship. The relationship is between socioeconomic status and crime. Poor people commit street crimes because they lack legitimate opportunities. Okay, period. That's, you know, we can't really figure out, causes of crime and all that to a great extent, except that we know that poverty is related to street crime. And the more financially destitute a group is, the more likely they are to be involved in criminal activities based on their poverty, not on their race. Okay. So this colorblind racism is really a way of saying, well, even though I'm going to try to pretend like I'm treating everyone the same, I'm not judging them on color, I'm judging them on their behavior. It allows you to continue to judge someone based on the fact that they've been discriminated against historically. So proponents of colorblind racism would be opposed to affirmative action programs, welfare assistance, and largely government-funded health insurance on the basis of the idea that these people are undeserving because they're poor. It's really an attack on the poor in this country when we start attacking social welfare programs. And I think, as I mentioned in chapter 12, the last video, last chapter, I pointed out that the largest group of people who are receiving government assistance are actually whites. When about almost 40% of the population of folks who are receiving government assistance are white. Black Hispanics make up a slightly smaller group, and Hispanic Americans make up a smaller section of that as well. So, but altogether, it ends up adding up to 100%. So racial inequality is perpetuated by this idea of color blindness. And so what we're saying is that when you start judging people on their merits, if you forget about the fact that certain groups have been discriminated against for hundreds of years, that you're really not judging them on a level playing field, that they started out way behind through genocide and slavery and all these things. They didn't start out at the same place that the other groups did. So that's what sociologists refer to as color-blind racism. It's also referred to as covert racism because people are trying to hide their prejudices. And the color line is still in place, even if people don't want to acknowledge that it exists. People like Donald Trump will say, well, more whites are killed by police officers than blacks. Well, yeah, but whites make up 60% of the population. So are 60% of those killed by police officers white? I kind of doubt it. And so we can see, a white person who commits a heinous crime and kills 20 or 30 people, and they're taken into custody, and an African American person who is unarmed may be killed in their car. Now, I know those are anecdotal situations, and we can't say conclusively that that proves that cops are racist, and I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to say that people do have different life chances based on the color of their skin in the greatest country in the world, what we think is the greatest country in the world. There's still uneven playing field. Okay. So as I said, discrimination is a little bit different from prejudice because now we're talking about actual behaviors, not choosing someone to be on your team because of their racial category, whether we're talking about a study group or whatever. I had a friend who was a civil engineering major at UT Arlington, and he said that some of the guys that he went to school with were really very sexist in the way that they interacted with each other, because they would have study groups and they wouldn't invite the female students in the program because women shouldn't be civil engineers. They should go back home and be homemakers. Now my friend was not sexist like that, but he found it disturbing that his fellow students would exclude females from the study group just because they were females, as if they weren't capable or shouldn't be there. Okay, so sometimes it's not that you're picking somebody and doing something to them. You may just be excluding them. That's still discriminatory behavior. So prejudice attitudes are not the same as discriminatory behavior. Obviously, discrimination persists even for those who are the most well-educated and qualified minority members. A lot of times their success is attributed to, oh, well, it must be affirmative action, right? So that certainly continues to be a bit of a problem. Research has shown that race is more important than a criminal background to potential employers. So if you're trying to get a job, being an African American or a Muslim may be more of an impediment than having a criminal history. So you could be white and have a criminal history and get hired over someone who belongs to a minority group but has no criminal history. That's a very serious concern. So when we look at discriminatory behavior and how that impacts people directly, if you look at Figure 10-2, the U.S. median income by race, ethnicity, and gender. Now, this table is very interesting, and I think it's got a lot of great information and useful information, but we have to keep in mind that this is looking at all incomes for people in different groups, and we're not breaking it out by level of education or anything like that. We're just looking at race and gender, or ethnicity and gender, and earnings. And so we see that the group that's faring the best here is not white men, it's actually Asian men. Their median income is $63,239 a year. But they are followed quite closely by white males with an annual income of $56,386. And so it goes down, and you can see then that finally you've got Asian women at $50,831, white women at $43,346, all the way down to Hispanic women at $30,482. So I think if you look at that, you can see that the lives of people are different on the basis of their racial or ethnic heritage and their gender, regardless of whether this is a result of individual choices to go into career fields that don't pay as much or whatever. There are differences in their lives, and some of that difference is likely due to prejudice and discrimination. Okay. So we live in a society that is characterized by a lot of racism and prejudice and discrimination. We have this definition of a concept called the sharing economy. It's made up of online economic transactions that place buyers and sellers in direct peer-to-peer contact with no change of ownership of goods and services. There are some concerns about old-fashioned discrimination. Guests with distinctively African American names are 16 percent less likely to receive accommodations through things like Airbnb. So what we're talking about here is people who are able to make online economic transactions like Airbnb, VRBO, I think Vacation Rentals by Owner, I think is the name of that organization. And we see that when we look at those transactions, we see that whites are more likely to receive accommodations than other groups, particularly African Americans. Black users are more likely to have rides canceled by Uber drivers. And so the old problem of African Americans having a hard time getting a taxi are still alive and well with us, because today it's with Uber drivers. Okay. And you may have heard of this concept of the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling refers to an invisible barrier that keeps people from advancing and achieving upward social mobility on the basis of gender or racial or ethnic categories. If someone is, in the work environment and they're moving up, and then at some point they kind of hit a ceiling, and they see their people that were hired in behind them and with them continuing to move up the corporate ladder, but they cannot advance in spite of the fact that they're doing high quality work. They may have experienced that glass ceiling as a result of discrimination. Okay. So there's this concept of white privilege, or the privileges of the dominant group. Some students don't believe that white privilege exists. I think if you're willing to go to the library or get online and look at some of the articles, there are about 2,000 articles that have been written over the years about white privilege. And there's also male privilege. Males, now you may not think of it as privilege, but when a male can go walk out through a dark parking lot and get into his car without fear of being sexually assaulted or robbed, and yet women who have to go out and get in their car in the same parking lot are fearful and may have to call security or have a friend walk them to their car because they're fearful of being victimized. That's an example of male privilege. And so things that might not immediately occur to us as being an example of privilege can be an example of privilege. And we know that white males tend to have better opportunities than a lot of other groups. And so there certainly is a thing such as white privilege or male privilege or white male privilege, to be quite honest with you. White privilege refers to the rights or immunities granted to people as a particular benefit or favor simply because they're white. So if you go into a retail store and you're walking around and nobody's really paying any attention to you, and you're able to browse without even thinking about being monitored or followed, that's a different experience than someone who goes into a retail outlet, a retail store, and they are immediately followed around the store and observed to see if they're shoplifting. So feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh was one of the leaders in studying white privilege. And if you'll read a little Peggy McIntosh, I think she'll be able to convince you that white privilege does exist. You might still disagree on how pervasive it is, but she presents a very convincing argument. And like I said, our very library has somewhere around 2,000 articles about white privilege. So I don't think sociologists would be spending all those months and months of doing that research if it was about something that doesn't actually exist. She found that she rarely needed to step out of her comfort zone when she was engaging in social activities, from finding good places to live to shopping without security following her around. So she looked at her life and she said, well, gosh, my life seems to be different from the lives of some of my friends who are people of color. And I suspect that that's true. I think, the privileged group sometimes has a hard time realizing that other groups don't have it just as good as they do. If you're not one of the people who are being discriminated against, it's hard sometimes to see the privilege that people have. As a white male in our society, I suspect that I have benefited from, there have been times when police officers would pull me over for maybe driving a little too fast, and they'd look at me with my gray hair and my white skin and, older guy, and they would say, okay, just slow it down, I'm going to give you a warning. Um, that might have been a different experience had I been a person of color, had I been younger, and been viewed as a group that's more prone to criminal behavior. Okay. He didn't search my car. He didn't, I've had my car searched one time in my life, and that's when I was a teenager, about 19 years of age. And so, uh, I've been pulled over by police officers a number of times over those years, but one time was there a search, and that's it. So I suspect if I was a person of color, I would have a harder time making that statement. Okay. And think about it. When white parents see their child getting ready, their teenage child getting ready to go and get in their car and drive somewhere for a social event, do white parents feel the necessity to have a conversation with their child and tell them exactly how they need to interact if they come in contact with police, if they don't want to end up in a body bag? Unfortunately, a lot of parents of color feel like they have to have those conversations with their sons and daughters when they leave the house. And that is a further example that there is such a thing as white privilege. Okay. Another example of how minority groups have been discriminated against is in the case of redlining. Redlining is a pattern of discrimination where banks would look at certain neighborhoods and they would draw red lines around those neighborhoods, and they'd say, we're not lending money to buy homes in those neighborhoods. Unfortunately, when we were highly segregated in terms of our residential patterns, that meant that a lot of African Americans could not borrow money to buy a home in their neighborhoods because their neighborhoods were off limits. They were redlined. Redlining is officially against the law nowadays. Banks are not supposed to do it, but I suspect that it probably still occurs more frequently than we'd like to know. It was especially rampant. This redlining was especially rampant during the first half of the 20th century, but it's still an issue today. And researchers have found that black residents of black neighborhoods in Baltimore end up paying more, 5 to 11% more in their monthly payments than comparable white residents in white neighborhoods. And if you're poor, there are lots of ways where you end up paying more than people who are not poor. So for middle class people who need a loan, they go to the bank and they get a loan and they pay 6-7% interest maybe. If you're a poor person and a person of color who's been discriminated against and you don't have a good credit history or you don't have any credit history, you may have to go to the cash store and pay 100% interest on a loan. You borrow $500 and over a course of 6 months you end up paying $1,000 back. And if you go to the corner grocery store, you're going to pay more than if you can afford to drive around to 2 or 3 grocery stores and hit all the sales. But if you don't have a car and you have to go to the local grocery store, you get a lesser quality of food and a lesser product, alternatives on the shelves. And in many cases, you'll end up paying a higher price for fattier meats and things of that nature at the corner grocery store. Not all of this is intentional on the part of the dominant group, but there are lots of disadvantages to being poor and to being poor and a person of color in this country. So let's talk about institutional discrimination. It's a little bit different from individual discrimination, where one individual is choosing not to hire someone or one individual is choosing not to rent their home to someone on the basis of membership to a minority group. Institutional discrimination refers to the denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups that results from the normal operations of society. So, for example, let's say that you are setting up the regulations and the requirements to be a firefighter. I think we would all agree that firefighters, not everyone can be a firefighter. Not everyone has the courage. Not everyone has the strength. Not everyone can be a firefighter. But there might be some criteria that we put into place that would keep qualified people, otherwise qualified people, from joining the fire department on the basis of things that really aren't related to being a good firefighter. For example, if we think about how tall a firefighter should be, does a firefighter have to be 7 feet tall? Well, no, I've known some 7-footers who probably wouldn't make very good firemen because they didn't have the body strength to do what firemen have to do, firefighters. Let's not be sexist, right? So firefighters need to be able to rescue people from burning buildings. They need to be able to carry someone. So physical strength is probably going to be a requirement. Being able to carry, a person out of a burning building is probably an important requirement. But I've known some people who were kind of short, but really strong. And one of the requirements that we saw that fire departments put into place is, well, you have to be 5'7" or taller. Someone who's 5'6.5" doesn't meet the requirements. We know that Hispanic males tend to be shorter than white males and black males. And so that regulation tends to disproportionately impact them. Now, what about a 5'6" tall bodybuilder who can lift 400 pounds? They probably could be a good firefighter, but because you said, well, you've got to be 5'7" or taller, that leaves them out of that excludes them. And so that would be an example. Another example of institutional discrimination is some years ago, in order to join a union, the unions could say, well, if you're not white, you can't join the union. Okay. Well, we've eliminated that legal discrimination by saying, hey, you can't say, people can't join a union because of their race. So what some unions did very quickly was they adopted new standards, and they said, well, in order to join our union, you need to have a relative who belonged to the union before you. So your dad, an uncle, somebody like that. Well, okay, so you're not excluding somebody on the basis of their skin color, but you're excluding them on the basis of their dad or their uncle wasn't able to join the union at a time when unions were able to discriminate on the basis of race. And so ultimately, you're just kicking the can down the road and still discriminating on the basis of race, just one generation removed, right? So that would be another example of institutional discrimination, and it certainly would not be considered acceptable. Some other examples that the Commission on Civil Rights has identified of institutional discrimination: rules that require that only English be spoken at a place of work, preferences shown by law and medical schools in the admission of children of wealthy and influential alumni. If a person is a person of color, they may not be able to get into the medical school because their dad, their grandpa, previous generations were excluded from joining, and that therefore then excludes them because they don't have that alumni connection. Okay, and then restrictive employment leave policies coupled with prohibitions on part-time work that can negatively impact single-parent families. So if you start imposing obstacles for single parents, that can be discriminatory because it negatively impacts people of color more than it does the dominant group. Okay. The 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination in public accommodations and publicly owned facilities on the basis of race, color, creed, national origin, and gender. And what we started doing in the 1960s is we implemented a number of affirmative action programs. And affirmative action programs refer to positive efforts to recruit qualified minority group members or women for jobs, promotions, and educational opportunities. The idea was that, hey, we didn't start out with a level playing field, so we're going to tilt it a little bit in the other direction and give people who have historically been discriminated against a little more of an opportunity for a while and try to level the playing field over time. But such efforts are sometimes resented by people who are in the dominant group, who now call this reverse discrimination. And we're seeing that a number of legal cases, lawsuits have been filed to do away with affirmative action programs. For many years, those lawsuits were not successful, but in the last 10, 15 years, we've started to see see judges ruling in the favor of the dominant group again. And so affirmative action programs, unfortunately, I think are going to be scaled down and ultimately eliminated, even though, what the judges are saying is, okay, we had affirmative action for a period of time, that's leveled the playing field, we don't have to do that anymore. And the reality is that the playing field is somewhat more level, but it's still not level. And I think it's a little premature to eliminate affirmative action programs, but I understand that that's becoming the law of the land. And I do understand that whites may feel that they are being discriminated against because they're white, because people who scored lower on the standardized test might be admitted over them because of their history of discrimination against their people. So I see both sides of the argument, but the reality is that it's still not a level playing field. But it looks like affirmative action programs are not going to be long for this world in the United States. And so we're seeing affirmative action programs being eliminated. I think it's a little premature, but it is the law of the land. And so I really like what TCC does when it tries to hire a new faculty member or a new administrator. We are not going to hire someone, and I've been on a number of hiring committees. We don't hire someone because of their race or their ethnicity, but what we will do is we look at the pool of applicants and we look at the people who we think would be well suited and have the best qualifications and meet the criteria for the job. And then once we identify a pool of 4 or 5 candidates, we will usually interview those individuals. And if we've got 2 individuals who are about equally, qualified for the job and equally impress us, we'll look to see if they can add some diversity to our campus. Most of the professors over the 50-year history of, Northeast campus have probably been white males, and, with a nice helping of white females more recently. But we are trying to increase the diversity. We think it's important for our students to hear the perspectives of people from different experiences. And if we can hire someone who is Hispanic or who is female or, comes from another country, has immigrated recently from another country, and they're qualified, and they add to our diversity, then oftentimes we will extend that person a job offer because we want our students to see people who are like them in the front of the classroom, leading the lectures and giving, leading discussions and giving lectures to our students. We think it's important for all, people to be represented in our administration and our faculty, just as they are in our student body. And so, we're not going to hire someone who's less qualified because they fit into one of those minority groups. But if we can find people that we think are equally qualified, then we're going to look at diversity and see, can we increase our diversity on this campus as a result of hiring someone who is very well qualified but brings something different, a different perspective to the table. And to me, I think that's a great way of looking at it and moving forward. Okay. So let's talk about the sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity and discrimination. The functionalists are going to say that racial prejudice and discrimination are positive for the dominant group. And certainly that's true. If you're part of the dominant group and you are benefiting from discrimination, then certainly you might see that as a positive for your group and for yourself individually. Okay. We're going to talk about some problems with that here in a minute. Conflict theorists see it as just central to the exploitation of minorities. It's slavery in a different form. If we think about sharecroppers and their experiences, their lives were not significantly better than the lives of some slaves because they were still poor and still denied voting opportunities and economic opportunities and things of that nature through Jim Crow laws and things of that nature. And so if you can keep a group subordinate, then they can do your, your housekeeping and your busboy jobs and your waitressing jobs. You've got a ready pool of people who are willing to do some pretty dirty work for very low wages. That does tend to benefit the dominant group in society. Labeling theorists who come from the symbolic interactionist approach will talk about how we develop labels and stereotypes of different groups and how our behaviors then push people to behave the way we've accused them of behaving. If you say that, well, this person is African American and therefore they're more likely to be criminals, so I'm not going to give them a job, then that individual then who has struggles to find a job in the legitimate opportunity structure may be forced to resort to the illegitimate opportunity structure and get involved in criminal activity, kind of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Okay. Interactionists will stress the manner in which our everyday contacts between people of different racial and ethnic categories can contribute to either tolerance or hostility. And so we'll talk about how if you get people together interacting with each other, they often will overcome some of their feelings of prejudice, and that can lead to less discrimination. But that typically only works when those individuals have similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, in other words, you can't take an upper class white person and have them interacting with lower class people and expect that that's going to reduce the prejudice of the upper class white person. Okay, they need to have at least similar socioeconomic backgrounds in order for that to reduce the feelings of prejudice. Okay, so the functionalist perspective will identify several different positive benefits for those who practice discrimination. For example, racist views provide a moral justification for maintaining an unequal society. If your statement is that, well, I'm a German in Nazi Germany, and I believe that Jewish people are the source of our problems. Those Jews are the problem. Then that allows you to feel better about who you are and to justify the poor treatment of Jewish people because they are being scapegoated for all the problems that Nazi Germany was dealing with after the end of World War One, rather than looking at the fact that World War One ended badly for Germany and that left their economy in a pretty rough place. Maybe the problem was we haven't gotten over the negative outcomes, the negative economic impacts from World War One, instead of looking at the Jewish population and blaming all the problems on Jewish people. Okay. So racist views provide a justification for treating people differently. Racist beliefs discourage the subordinate group from attempting to question its status. So if this is just the way it is and we're less intelligent and less capable and less hardworking, and that's why I'm in the position I'm in, I can't really fight that, right? So if we believe that if we come to believe that we're an inferior people, then of course we're at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Okay, but if we throw those beliefs off and say, well, wait a minute, what's really going on here? That may have us questioning whether everybody has the same chances in society. And then racial myths suggest that any major societal change would only bring about more economic trouble to the lower classes and actually lower their standard of living. That's another benefit for those who practice discrimination. You can just say, well, we can't really, this problem is so huge and so hard to tackle. If we try to do anything, it'd just make it worse. That can reinforce maintaining the status quo. And of course, functionalists would see that benefits the dominant group, but conflict theorists would say, there's a problem there. Okay, that's inequality. Now, functionalists also will point out that there are some dysfunctions associated with racism. And I'm going to go off a little bit off script here and give you an example of what we mean by that. Okay, so some of you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the very bottom of that pyramid, if you've ever seen Maslow's pyramid, where he shows the different kinds of needs that people have to satisfy in order to become self-actualizing human beings. Okay, so what does it mean to self-actualize? Well, that means to, to steal the phrase from the Army ads, to be all you can be. So for Jack Herod to be the best Jack Herod he can be, he needs to be able to take his skills and hone and sharpen those skills to be the best that he can be. And if there are areas where he can improve, he should address those as well, right? Well, if you're worried about getting shot in school or beaten up and having your lunch money taken away from you on the walk home or the walk to school in the morning, you're going to have a hard time focusing on being the very best student that you can be. Okay, so self-actualization is this idea that we are going to sharpen our skills and we're going to be the best Jack Herod or whatever that we can be. But if we're denied opportunities, if we live in an unsafe environment, if we can't take care of our needs for nutrition and shelter and clothing and all of that, then it's going to be hard to be self-actualizing. Okay, so Maslow talked about how it was important to try to meet safety needs and physiological needs and needs for sense of belonging and esteem and all of that. And if we meet all of those needs, then we can really focus on self-actualizing. You guys are attempting to self-actualize by taking college classes and trying to get a degree and expand your view of the world and to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, hopefully. Okay? So if indeed you are attempting to self-actualize and your car breaks down and you don't have any way to get it fixed, and that keeps you from going to class and going to campus, if there weren't a virus, going to campus, then certainly you would be prohibited from self-actualizing by the economic hardships that you're encountering. Okay, so this idea of self-actualizing and being the best you can be. President Trump ran in 2016 on this, let's make America great again. And my question has been, okay, so we're going to make America great again. So that suggests that there was a time in our history when America was greater than it is now. And so when would that be? When was America great for all Americans? Well, we can't say that while we were wiping out Native American populations that America was pretty, great for those folks. We can't say that before women got the right to vote that America was great for them. We can't say that before, slavery was abolished that America was great for them. So point to a decade in American existence when everybody in this country had it great. There's not a decade. Okay, so I do believe that we want to make America great. We want to be self-actualizing as a country. We want this to be the greatest country in the world, that concept of American exceptionalism. But as long as we're discriminating against a sizable percentage of our population and saying, you can't do that because you're XYZ, I'm not sure that we can really be self-actualizing as a country, and I'm not sure we can claim to be the greatest country in the world if we are excluding sizable percentages of our population from full participation in all of our resources, okay, and all of our opportunities. So that doesn't mean that we have to give people who are unqualified jobs that they're not qualified for. It just means that we need to make sure that our public schools do a great job of educating all of our children, whether they're located in inner city areas or whether they're, in South Lake Carrollton. We need to make sure that all of our children have an opportunity to go to a clean environment, a safe environment, and go to school and learn what they need to learn to move on and to achieve upward social mobility. And as long as we're not doing that, we're not really a great country. We're not or at least not as great as we can be. Okay, so I would certainly welcome some discussions about how we make America great for all Americans. Okay, so when society fails fails to use the resources of all individuals, we're really missing out, okay? And discrimination prevents that by preventing us from getting the maximum from everyone. Discrimination also aggravates social problems and places the financial burden of solving those problems on the dominant group. So we end up spending a lot of money building prisons and building psychiatric hospitals and things of that nature because we don't give everybody opportunities to achieve a meaningful life. Okay. Society must invest a good deal of money and time to defend its barriers to the full participation of all members. How many lawsuits have been filed over discrimination? If we would just stop discriminating, then we wouldn't have all those lawsuits tying up the courts and spending, thousands and thousands of dollars on lawyers for each case. And then lastly, racial prejudice and discrimination often undercut goodwill and friendly diplomatic relations between nations. How can we encourage China to stop putting their Uyghur population in concentration camps when we could be accused of doing the same thing to African Americans in this country? How can we justify our claims that other countries are not treating their citizens in an appropriate manner when we've carried out genocide against Native Americans, slavery against African Americans, and now, forced labor out of a lot of our poor people in this society due to the fact that they're poor and can't always pay their bills. Okay. So, I think functionalists are very accurate in saying that it may be functional for the dominant group, but it's not necessarily functional for society as a whole. We're losing out on a lot of human potential that could really benefit us if we would try to make every American be the best they can be and to self-actualize. Okay. Now, the conflict perspective is going to rely pretty heavily on what is called exploitation theory. And it says that racism keeps minority and low-paying jobs and supplies the capitalist ruling class with a pool of cheap labor. As long as unemployment is around 5 to 8 to 12 or even 15%, you're going to have a lot of people out there that are unemployed who are looking for work, and they will do dirty jobs for fairly low wages in order to survive. And so it's actually, conflict theorists are saying it's beneficial to the wealthy to exploit the lower classes because they can have landscapers and housekeepers, that are uneducated and come from other countries who are immigrants, in some cases illegal immigrants, because they can't complain if they're not treated fairly because they'll be deported back to their home country. So when you can restrict wages for people because there's a large pool of surplus labor who will go and work in the factories because, hey, you don't like my job, you don't like the way you're being treated, I'll replace you. As long as you've got that kind of exploitive relationship with the labor force, the dominant group is going to be in power and they're going to benefit from that. And so capitalists can restrict the wages of all members of the proletariat. This is known as Marxist class theory. We've talked about Marxism before. However, your textbook notes that this theory is too limited to explain all the prejudice that we see in society, but it does explain a great deal of it. The labeling theory, as I mentioned earlier, is going to talk about racial profiling. And we see that the practice is often based on explicit stereotypes. If I look at it this way, if I'm getting onto an airplane and I have to go through security and TSA checks me and I assume the position and they scan me and I'm okay to get on the airplane, why isn't the Muslim person who is right behind me and does the same thing, why are they not safe to get on the airplane? If it's not safe for them to get on the airplane without going through a full body, pat down, then it really wasn't safe for me to get on the airplane without a full pat down, right? Because I just don't think that we should assume that people who are of Muslim faith are a greater threat to us than than Jack Herod would be, and therefore they deserve more scrutiny than the dominant white group. So again, I think racial profiling is a problem. Research shows that it's based on false stereotypes and prejudice, and yet a lot of Americans still approve of it and think it's okay. Stop and frisk programs where police officers were allowed to stop and frisk people just on the basis of, oh well, they look suspicious because they had brown skin. That certainly should not be allowed, and I'm glad to see that some police departments are beginning to do away with that. But recent events suggest that the police are not responding well to the criticism of their use of force, and in some cases they've become more violent and more forceful in the way they react to things. That's not a helpful response. Okay. The public generally approves of racial profiling of Arab Americans at airports and things of that nature. The Black Lives Movement has really developed out of a result of racial profiling and inappropriate use of force by police officers. And we know that President Trump ordered a ban on immigration from 7 predominantly Muslim nations in 2017. And so people traveling to this country may be denied entry simply because they come from a predominantly Muslim nation. They may be Christians or they may be Muslim, but because they're coming from a Muslim country, they can't enter the United States. That kind of racial profiling doesn't keep us safer, and it just creates more anger and frustration and hostility. So I think it's counterproductive. Now, the interactionist perspective is going to talk about what they call the contact hypothesis, and I kind of broached this a moment ago when I said that if you get people together of different racial and ethnic backgrounds but similar socioeconomic statuses, and you get them to work on something that they can't resolve on their own, they need to cooperate and help each other, that those experiences can reduce prejudice and discrimination between those groups. So let me give you an example. Let's say that Dallas Independent School District wanted to put together a citizen task force on educational inequality. And so they got middle class white parents and middle class Hispanic parents and middle class Black parents and middle class Asian parents and middle class, all these different groups. They all come from the middle class, but they're from different racial and ethnic categories, and we bring them together and we say, we need you, here's what's going on in Dallas Independent School District today. Here are some of the issues that we face. Here's some of the funding problems, the budgetary problems and things of that nature. Here are the things that we see as being the biggest problems facing Dallas Independent School District going forward from here. So we want you guys to come up with some potential solutions, and you guys are going to you're going to pick out 3 or 4 of the problems that you think are most important, and you're going to research those problems, and you're going to try to figure out how to develop programs and policies that will help us to better educate our young people. Okay. I think a couple of things are going to happen in that situation. First of all, you're probably going to get some really good input on how we can better educate our students. And secondly, it's very likely that the members of that task force are going to develop an appreciation and perhaps even friendships with each other, and they're going to come away with that experience feeling less prejudiced against each other. Okay, so I think that contact hypothesis is very, very useful because it tells us the solution to our problem is to join together and work together and get to know each other, and that will help to reduce the prejudice and discrimination. Now, the reason that I said that it had to happen with groups of similar status, if you take very wealthy white people and put them together with people who are really culturally and not just different in terms of race and ethnicity, but culture and socioeconomic status, it's unlikely that they're going to find common ground and reduce that discrimination. As a matter of fact, that those feelings of prejudice may become worsened rather than better. Okay. So I think it's probably a good time for me to take a break. I'll stop there, and when I come back, I'm going to talk about how minority groups and dominant groups can interact with each other. This is that spectrum of intergroup relations. I'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll try and then we'll talk a little bit about the different groups that we're talking about in society and some of the things that they've experienced. But that should give us a pretty good foundation for Chapter 10. All right, see you in a minute, guys. Bye.